Dirt under fingernails rarely pays off in Oakhaven. Decades of busted combines and foreclosed acres taught us that. Then Anders showed up. He leased the dead soil on the ridge, fenced it tight, and refused to say what he was burying. We laughed. By November, nobody was laughing. Anders Castillo did not look like a man about to turn an entire county on its head. He looked like every other worn-out ghost haunting the booths of the local diner. Slumped shoulders, faded flannel, hands mapped with scars and grease stains that no amount of pumice soap would ever scrub out. When he signed the lease on the old Miller tract, 200 acres of rocky, nitrogen-starved dirt that had broken 3 families in a row, the regulars at the diner barely looked up from their coffee. "Fool and his money," Harlan Brooks had muttered, stabbing a piece of sausage with his fork. Harlan farmed 3,000 acres of corn and soy. He owed the bank enough money to buy a small island, and he carried that debt like a loaded shotgun, always ready to go off. "That dirt is dust. You couldn't grow weeds on the Miller tract if you watered them with miracles." Anders hadn't reacted. He just folded the lease, put it in his breast pocket, and walked out to his rusted Chevy. The first sign that something was off wasn't the plowing. It was the fencing. Farmers in Oakhaven didn't build privacy fences. You put up barbed wire to keep the heifers off the highway, maybe some woven wire if you had hogs. Anders bought chain link, 6 feet high, topped with an angled bracket that hinted at razor wire he never actually installed. He bought it all from Carrie Black at the town hardware store, paying in heavy, crumpled stacks of cash that smelled like mildew and old diesel. Carrie counted the bills twice. She was a pragmatic woman, widowed by a tractor rollover 10 years prior, and she knew the margins of agriculture better than the bank manager. "This is a lot of galvanized steel for a couple hundred acres of bad dirt, Anders," she said, leaning over the counter. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed a steady, irritating hum. "You planning to farm or build a prison camp?" Anders smiled. It was a tight, guarded expression. "Just want to keep the deer out, Carrie. Deer can jump 6 feet. Not if they can't see what's on the other side." 2 days later, the green privacy tarps went up. Miles of heavy, opaque fabric, zipping tied to the chain link, completely obstructing the view from the county road. Harlan Brooks drove his $90,000 dual-wheel pickup past Anders's property 3 times that week. The secrecy ate at him. In a town where everyone knew the moisture content of your topsoil and the exact date your tractor loan was due, secrecy was an insult. It was a violation of the misery they all shared. If you were going to go bankrupt planting corn at $3 a bushel, you were supposed to do it where everyone could see you. April arrived, bringing the biting, unpredictable spring rains. Most farmers were rushing to get seed in the ground, watching the radar with bloodshot eyes, praying the fields would dry out enough to support the weight of a planter. Anders's fields remained quiet during the day. Then came the trucks. They arrived between midnight and 3 in the morning, unmarked, refrigerated semi-trailers idling heavily at the chained gate of the Miller tract. Carrie Black lived half a mile down the road. She woke to the low, thrumming vibration of their diesel engines rattling her bedroom window. She sat on her porch in her bathrobe, smoking a cigarette, watching the red taillights turn into Anders's property. They didn't look like seed trucks. They didn't look like fertilizer deliveries. They looked industrial, heavily secured, and entirely out of place on a fractured asphalt county road. By mid-May, the planting was over. The county settled into the anxious waiting game that defined the summer. Harlan's corn was up, neat little rows of pale green stretching out toward the horizon. But Harlan wasn't looking at his corn. He was looking at Anders's green tarps. "He's growing weed," Harlan announced one afternoon at the feed store, leaning against a pallet of salt blocks. "Has to be. Marijuana." Only thing that pays enough to justify commercial privacy fencing. I ought to call the sheriff." "Sheriff drove out there last week," Carrie said, not looking up from her inventory ledger. "Anders let him right through the gate. Sheriff stayed 10 minutes, came out, and went about his business." Harlan frowned. "Well, what did he say?" "Said it looked like a lot of dirt. Said Anders had all his paperwork." Carrie closed the ledger with a sharp snap. "Leave the man be, Harlan. He's paying his bills. More than I can say for some folks." Harlan flushed, the red creeping up his thick neck. "We'll see. Bad dirt is bad dirt. Whatever he put in there, the ground will choke it out. But behind the fences, something was happening. There was no dust. Even on the windiest days, when the topsoil from Harlan's vast fields blew across the highway in choking brown clouds, the air above Anders's property remained perfectly clear. He had laid miles of drip irrigation tape. Carrie knew she had ordered the specialized couplings for him, and he was managing the moisture with microscopic precision. Nobody saw the crop. They only saw Anders. He came into town once a week for groceries and fuel. He looked thinner, his face hollowed out by exhaustion, but there was a sharp, undeniable light in his eyes. It was the look of a man who was holding a winning lottery ticket and was just waiting for the bank to open. "How's the beans, Anders?" Harlan asked him loudly one morning at the gas pumps. Anders slowly screwed the cap back onto his truck's tank. He didn't blink. "Growing. Must be some special beans to need all that plastic on the fence." Anders met Harlan's gaze. There was no fear in the older man's eyes, just a deep, immovable calm. "Good fences make good neighbors, Harlan. Best of luck with your corn." He drove away, leaving Harlan standing in a puddle of spilled gasoline, furious and entirely powerless. July hit Oak Haven like a hammer on an anvil. The rain simply stopped. The weather pattern stalled, trapping the county under a high-pressure dome that baked the moisture out of the air and turned the clay into concrete. The heat was relentless. It warped the air above the asphalt and sent the cicadas into a screaming frenzy in the remaining trees. For the farmers, it wasn't just weather. It was a slow-motion financial execution. Harlan Brooks was losing his mind. His corn, which had started so promising, began to roll its leaves, a desperate defensive measure to conserve water. By the second week of July, the lower leaves were turning a brittle, sickly yellow. He was running his pivot irrigators 24 hours a day, draining the local aquifer, burning thousands of dollars in diesel just to keep the crop on life support. The bank called him twice a week. He stopped answering. The diner, usually loud with complaints and dark humor, went dead silent. Men sat over lukewarm coffee, staring at their phones, endlessly refreshing weather apps that showed nothing but punishing, cloudless sunshine. Except for Anders Castillo. Anders didn't have massive pivot irrigators. He hadn't drilled a new, deep-water well. He had a small, aging pump that pulled from a shallow pond on the back of his property. Yet, the pond never seemed to go dry, and the pump rarely ran. Carrie Black drove her pickup out to the Miller tract on a Tuesday evening to deliver a replacement belt for Anders's generator. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the cracked earth. The heat radiating off the highway was visible, thick and wavering. She pulled up to the chained gate and honked. A few minutes later, Anders appeared from behind the green privacy tarp. He looked exhausted, covered in a fine layer of sweat and dust. But he didn't have the haunted, hollow look of the other farmers. He unlocked the gate and swung it open. "Appreciate the delivery, Carrie," he said, taking the belt. "I'd have come into town, but I can't leave them right now. Critical phase." "Critical phase of what, Anders?" she asked gently. She leaned against the open window of her truck, trying to get a look past him. The tarp was pulled back just a few feet, but the angle was tight. Still, she caught a glimpse. It wasn't corn. It wasn't soy. It wasn't hemp or marijuana. The plants were low to the ground, sprawling in wide, dense clusters. The leaves were thick, almost fleshy, a deep, vibrant blue-green that seemed to defy the blistering heat. They looked alien against the stark, bleached landscape of Oakhaven, but it was the smell that hit her hardest. It wasn't the dusty organic scent of typical crops. It was sharp, peppery, complex. It smelled like crushed stone, citrus, and something profoundly earthy. It made her mouth water instantly. Anders noticed her staring. He shifted, blocking her view. "Just experimenting with some drought-resistant varieties," he said, his voice flat. "Anders, I've lived in farm country for 50 years. I know what a soybean looks like, and I know what weed looks like. That isn't either. Those leaves are thriving. Harlan's corn is dying 3 miles down the road with an inch of water a day, and your soil looks bone dry." Anders sighed. He looked at the sky, watching the first stars push through the haze of the heat. "Water isn't always the answer, Carrie. Sometimes it's about what the roots are willing to endure. The harder they work, the more valuable the yield." He handed her a wad of cash for the belt, closed the gate, and locked the padlock. The town's anxiety mutated into resentment. Misery demands company, and Anders was refusing to participate. Harlan snapped in mid-August. He had just spent 4 hours trying to fix a blown seal on his main water pump, covered in grease and mosquito bites, knowing his yield was already cut in half. He walked into the diner for lunch, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, a sound that made his teeth grind. Anders was sitting in the corner booth, eating a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. He was reading a worn paperback, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that the county was burning to the ground around them. Harlan marched over, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. He slammed both hands down on Anders's table, rattling the coffee cup. "What are you pulling, Castillo?" Harlan snarled, his voice loud enough to stop the conversation at the counter. Anders carefully marked his page, closed the book, and looked up. "I'm eating my eggs, Harlan. Don't play stupid with me. You're sitting on 200 acres of the worst dirt in the state. You don't run sprinklers. You don't have a deep well. And yet I drove past your fence last night, and I could smell whatever you've got in there. It smells wet. It smells green, while the rest of us are losing our livelihoods." "I can't control the rain," Anders said evenly. "You're stealing water," Harlan accused, his voice rising, a vein throbbing at his temple. "You've got a bypass line tapped into the county main, or you're draining the groundwater out from under us. That's the only way." "The county meter reader checks my intake every month," Anders replied, his voice never losing its calm, steady cadence. "I use less water than the hardware store. You're bleeding out, Harlan, and you're looking for someone to blame. But it's not me. You planted a thirsty crop in a desert year." "Nobody plants what you planted," Harlan spat. "Because nobody knows what it is. It's some corporate Monsanto freak show, isn't it? They're paying you to test it." Anders picked up his fork. "If you damage my fence, Harlan, I'll press charges. If you trespass on my land, I'll defend it. Now, let me finish my lunch." Harlan stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, his fists clenched tight enough to turn his knuckles white. The whole diner watched. Slowly, realizing he had no leverage and no proof, Harlan backed away. He turned and stormed out into the blistering heat. Carrie watched from a booth a few tables over. She looked at Anders. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't angry. He just went back to eating his eggs. That night, Carrie couldn't sleep. The air in her house was thick and stagnant. She drove out to the county road, rolling the windows down to catch whatever breeze existed. She parked a quarter-mile from the Miller tract and turned off her headlights. She walked the ditch line, careful to avoid the dried thistle, until she reached the corner of Anders's fence. She didn't climb it. She just stood close to the green tarp. Through a small tear near a support post, she looked inside. The field was illuminated by soft, battery-powered lanterns placed meticulously along the rows. Anders was out there, walking slowly, inspecting the plants one by one. He was dusting them with a fine powder from a canvas bag, working with the painstaking care of a jeweler setting diamonds. The plants had grown. They were massive now, their thick stalks bowing slightly under the weight of something she couldn't quite see in the dim light. But she could hear them, in the dead, dry silence of the drought. As the wind rustled through the massive, fleshy leaves, the plants made a heavy, rustling sound. It didn't sound like agriculture. It sounded like money. Deep, staggering amounts of money. Carrie stepped back into the shadows and walked back to her truck. She didn't know what Anders Castillo had buried in the dead dirt of Oakhaven, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that when autumn came, the harvest was going to change everything. September arrived, bringing a bitter chill that finally snapped the heat wave. But no rain followed. The fields of Oakhaven stood as graveyards. Harlan's corn was entirely dead. The stalks were brittle, bleached yellow husks that rattled violently in the autumn wind. It sounded like bones grinding together. The bank sent the final notice on a Tuesday. Certified mail. Harlan didn't even open it. He recognized the heavy weight of the envelope and tossed it onto the dashboard of his truck, letting it sit there in the dust. He had 3 generations of Brooks blood in that land, and he was the one who was going to lose it to a man in a tailored suit who had never driven a combine. That night, Harlan drank half a bottle of cheap bourbon. It didn't numb him. It just sharpened the edges of his panic. At 2 a.m., he grabbed a pair of 30-inch bolt cutters from his machine shed and threw them into the bed of his truck. He didn't turn on his headlights as he rolled down the long gravel driveway. He navigated by the pale, indifferent light of a crescent moon. He parked a half-mile from the Miller tract, killing the engine and coasting into the ditch. The walk to Anders's fence was silent, save for the crunch of his boots on the parched earth. His breathing was heavy, fueled by a toxic mix of alcohol, exhaustion, and profound, suffocating jealousy. Harlan found a secluded stretch of the chain link, hidden from the county road by a slight rise in the topography. He slid the bolt cutters through the heavy green privacy tarp, found the metal links, and squeezed the handles. The steel snapped with a sharp, metallic ping. He cut another link, and another. He folded the wire back, tearing the tarp just enough to squeeze his wide shoulders through. The air inside the enclosure was entirely different. It was cool. It smelled heavy, rich, and sharply aromatic. Harlan stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees, and looked at the crop. The plants were knee-high, their sprawling, fleshy leaves curled tightly inward against the night chill. They were planted in perfectly measured rows, the drip tape running beneath them like black arteries. Harlan knelt next to the closest plant. He grabbed the thick stalk with a calloused hand and pulled. It didn't budge. He grunted, gripping it with both hands, digging his boots into the dry dirt, and hauled backward. The soil cracked. With a wet, tearing sound, the root system pulled free from the earth. Harlan fell backward on his hands. He stared at what he had unearthed. It wasn't a vegetable. It was a massive, gnarled tuber, the size of a football, covered in a thick, scaly rind. Where the roots had snapped, a thick golden resin oozed sluggishly into the cold air. The smell hit him instantly, intoxicating, medicinal, like crushed black pepper and lime zest. They bruise if you yank them like that. Harlan froze. He dropped the tuber. Anders Castillo stepped out from the shadows of the next row. He wasn't holding a shotgun. He didn't look angry. He was just holding a heavy-duty mag light, its beam pointed at the ground between them. "You're trespassing, Harlan." Harlan scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving. He pointed a shaking finger at the tuber. "What the hell is that, Anders? What are you growing?" Anders stepped closer, shining the light on the massive root. "It's a genetically stabilized hybrid of a desert nightshade. A pharmaceutical firm out of Basel holds the patent. The resin in that root is a primary stabilizing agent for a new neurological drug." Harlan stared at him, the bourbon slowing his comprehension. "Medicine? You're growing medicine?" "I'm growing a biological chemical," Anders corrected quietly, "and it only produces that resin when the plant is convinced it's going to die. If you put it in good topsoil, it grows massive leaves and zero resin. If you water it every day, the root rots. It needs terrible, nitrogen-starved dirt. It needs heat. It needs to be starved of water just to the edge of extinction. The harder it fights to survive, the more valuable it becomes." Anders looked up, meeting Harlan's bloodshot eyes. "That's why I bought the Miller tract, and that's why I didn't irrigate." The fight drained out of Harlan all at once. The anger, the jealousy, the furious pride. It all collapsed under the crushing weight of reality. He wasn't the victim of a water thief. He was just a man who had bet his life on the wrong crop in the wrong year. Harlan sank to his knees in the dirt. He put his face in his hands. The sound that came out of him was a raw, ugly sob. "They're taking the farm, Anders. The bank. 3,000 acres. My grandfather cleared that land with a team of mules. And I lost it." Anders didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell Harlan it would be okay. He just stood there in the cold air, listening to a groan moan break. "Put the root back in the dirt, Harlan," Anders said finally. "And go home. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." The trucks returned the second week of October. They arrived in broad daylight this time. 4 heavily armored, climate-controlled semi-trailers flanked by private security vehicles. They pulled through the gates of the Miller tract, kicking up clouds of dust that settled on the windshields of the cars parked along the highway. Half the town was out there. People sat on the hoods of their trucks, holding thermoses of coffee, watching in stunned silence as Anders's contracted labor crew began the extraction. They didn't use combines. They used specialized, low-impact trenchers that gently lifted the soil, exposing the massive resin-filled tubers. The air across the county filled with the sharp, peppery scent of the harvest. Carrie Black stood by the fence, her hands tucked into the pockets of her canvas coat. She watched Anders standing near the loading ramp, holding a clipboard, speaking quietly with a man in a dark overcoat. The man in the coat was cutting a check. Nobody knew the exact number, but rumors in Oakhaven spread faster than a grass fire. The yield on 200 acres of medical-grade botanical resin harvested at peak stress was astronomical. It was more money than the entire county's corn yield combined, 10 times over. Dirt under the fingernails had finally paid off. A week later, the county courthouse held its scheduled foreclosure auctions. The room was packed with grim, silent men holding their hats. Harlan Brooks sat in the front row, staring at the scuffed wooden floorboards. He wore his only suit. It smelled faintly of mothballs. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. "First lot. 3,000 acres, agricultural zoning, property of the Brooks family estate. Bank minimum is set at the arrears, $1.4 million. Harlan closed his eyes. "I'll take it at the minimum." The voice came from the back of the room. Harlan whipped his head around. Anders Castillo stood by the double doors. He was wearing his usual faded flannel and scuffed boots. He didn't look like a savior. He looked tired. The auctioneer blinked. "I have a bid for 1.4. Do I hear 1.5? Silence. The room was paralyzed. Sold, the auctioneer said, striking the gavel. Harlan stood up, his legs shaking. He pushed past his neighbors, walking down the center aisle until he stood face to face with Anders. Why? Harlan's voice was a ragged whisper. You just bought my family's blood. Anders looked at him, his expression entirely unreadable. He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket and handed it to Harlan. I didn't buy it to run you off, Harlan, Anders said, his voice low enough that only the two of them could hear. I bought the debt. The title stays in your name, provided you sign this contract. Harlan slowly unfolded the paper. It was a supplier agreement. Basil wants to quadruple production next year, Anders said flatly. They need 3,000 acres, but your soil is too good. We're going to have to ruin it. We're going to strip the nitrogen, plant cover crops that choke the nutrients, and turn your grandfather's pristine topsoil into dead dirt. Harlan stared at the numbers on the contract. His hand started to shake again. It was a guaranteed payout. It was enough to rebuild the barns, replace the tractors, and put his kids through college without taking a single dime in loans. You want me to kill my dirt, Harlan said. I want you to farm, Anders replied. I know the chemistry. I know the plant. But I don't know how to run a 1,000-acre logistics operation. You do. I need a manager who knows how to suffer through a drought without quitting. Anders turned and walked out of the courthouse, leaving Harlan holding the paper like it was a live wire. That winter, the diner was loud again. The oppressive, terrified silence had lifted. Harlan sat in the center booth, arguing loudly with his foreman about the best way to intentionally degrade their soil quality before the spring thaw. Carrie Black poured coffee behind the counter, smiling quietly to herself. Anders Castillo rarely came into town anymore. He stayed out on the ridge, prepping the seed stock for the spring. He had come to Oak Haven a ghost, carrying a secret nobody wanted to understand. He didn't bring a miracle, and he certainly didn't bring the rain. He just brought a deeply cynical truth. Sometimes, the most valuable things in this world only grow when everything else is falling apart. You just have to know what to plant in the ruins. If you enjoyed this grounded tale of survival, agricultural secrets, and the hard realities of rural life, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this story with a friend who appreciates a gritty comeback, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, gripping dramas. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Harlan's boots? Your support helps us tell more stories like this.